Codependent no more. Introduction. My first encounter with codependence occurred in the 60s. This was before people tormented by other people's behavior were called codependents. Before people addicted to alcohol and other drugs were labeled chemically dependent. Although I didn't know what codependents were, I usually knew who they were. As an alcoholic and addict, I stormed through life helping create other codependents. Codependents were a necessary nuisance. They were hostile, controlling, manipulative, indirect, guilt-producing, difficult to communicate with, generally disagreeable, sometimes downright hateful, and a hindrance to my compulsion to get high. They hollered at me, hid my pills, made nasty faces at me, poured my alcohol down the sink, tried to keep me from getting more drugs, wanting to know why I was doing this to them and asking what was wrong with me, but they were always there, ready to rescue me from my self-created disasters. The codependents in my life didn't understand me, and the misunderstanding was mutual. I didn't understand me, and I didn't understand them. My first professional encounter with codependence occurred years later in 1976. At the time in Minnesota, addicts and alcoholics had become chemically dependent, their families and friends had become significant others, and I had become a recovering addict and alcoholic. By then, I also worked as a counselor in a chemical dependency field, that vast network of institutions, programs, and agencies that helps chemically dependent people get well. Because I am a woman, and most of the significant others at that time were women, and because I had the least seniority and none of my coworkers wanted to do it, my employer at the Minneapolis Treatment Center told me to organize support groups for wives of addicts in the program. I wasn't prepared for this task. I still found codependence hostile, controlling, manipulative, indirect, guilt-producing, difficult to communicate with, and more. In my group, I saw people who felt responsible for the entire world, but they refused to take responsibility for leading and living their own lives. I saw people who constantly gave to others but didn't know how to receive. I saw people give until they were angry, exhausted, and emptied of everything. I saw some give until they gave up. I saw one woman give and suffer so much that she died of old age and natural causes at age 33. She was the mother of 5 children and the wife of an alcoholic who had been sent to prison for the 3rd time. I worked with women who were experts at taking care of everyone around them, and yet these women doubted their ability to take care of themselves. I saw mere shells of people, racing mindlessly from one activity to another. I saw people pleasers, martyrs, stoics, I don't know what word that is, tyrants, withering vines and clinging vines, maybe I should, and borrowing from H. Slacker's line in his play The Great White Hope, pinched up faces giving off the miseries. Most codependents were obsessed with other people. With great precision and detail, they could recite long lists of the addict's deeds and misdeeds, what he or she thought, felt, did, said, and what he or she didn't think, feel, do, and say. The codependent knew what the alcoholic or addict should and shouldn't do, and they wondered extensively why he or she didn't do it. Yet these codependents who had such great insight into others couldn't see themselves. They didn't know what they were feeling. They weren't sure what they thought, and they didn't know what, if anything, they could do to solve their problems, if indeed they had any other problems other than the alcoholics. It was a formidable group, these codependents. They were aching, complaining, and trying to control everyone and everything but themselves. And except for the few quiet pioneers in family therapy, many counselors, including me, didn't know how to help them. The chemical dependency field was flourishing, but help focused on the addict. Literature and training on family therapy were scarce. What did codependents need? What did they want? Weren't they just an extension of the alcoholic or a visitor to the treatment center? Why couldn't they cooperate instead of always making problems? The alcoholic had an excuse for being so crazy. He was drunk. The significant others had no excuse. They were this way sober. Soon I described 2 popular beliefs. These crazy codependents, the significant others, are sicker than the alcoholics, and no wonder the alcoholic drinks. Who wouldn't with a crazy spouse like that? By then I had been sober for a while. I was beginning to understand myself, but I didn't understand codependency. I tried, but couldn't, until years later when I became so caught up in the chaos of a few alcoholics that I stopped living my own life. I stopped thinking. I stopped feeling positive emotions. I was left with rage, bitterness, hatred, fear, depression, helplessness, despair, and guilt. At times, I wanted to stop living. I had no energy. I spent most of my time worrying about people and trying to figure out how to control them. I couldn't say no to anything but fun activities if my life depended on it, which it did. My relationships with friends and family members were in shambles. I felt terribly victimized. I lost myself, and I didn't know how it had happened. I didn't know what had happened. I thought I was going crazy, and I thought, shaking a finger at people around me, it's their fault. Sadly, aside from myself, nobody knew how badly I felt. My problems were my secret. Unlike the alcoholics and other troubled people in my life, I wasn't going around making big messes and expecting someone to clean them up after me. In fact, next to the alcoholics, I looked good. I was so responsible, so dependable. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I had a problem. I knew I felt miserable, but I didn't understand why my life was not working. After floundering in despair for a while, I began to understand. Like many people who judge others harshly, I realized I had just taken a very long and painful walk in the shoes of those I had judged. I now understood those crazy codependents. I had become one. Gradually, I began to climb back out of the abyss. Along the way, I developed a passionate interest in the subject of codependency. As a counselor, although I no longer worked full-time in the field, I still considered myself one. And as a writer, my counselor was provoked. As a flaming, careening codependent, a phrase borrowed from an Al-Anon member, who needed help, I also had a personal stake in the subject. What happens to people like me? How does it happen? Why? Most important, what do codependents need to feel better and stay that way? I talked to counselors, therapists, and codependents. I read the few available books on the subject and related topics. I reread the basics, the therapy books that have stood the test of time, looking for ideas that applied. I went to meetings of Al-Anon, a self-help group based on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, but geared toward the person who has been affected by another person's drinking. Eventually, I found what I was seeking. I began to see, understand, and change. My life started working again. Soon I was conducting another group for codependents at another Minneapolis treatment center. But this time, I had a vague notion of what I was doing. I still found codependents hostile, controlling, manipulative, indirect, and all the things I had found them before. I still saw all the peculiar twists of personality I previously saw. But I saw deeper. I saw people who were hostile. They had felt so much hurt that hostility was their only defense against being crushed again. They were that angry because anyone who had tolerated what they had would be that angry. They were controlling because everything around and inside of them was out of control. Always the dam of their lives and the lives of those around them threatened to burst and spew harmful consequences on anyone and everyone, and nobody but them seemed to notice or care. I saw people who manipulated because manipulation appeared to be the only way to get anything done. I worked with people who were indirect because the systems they lived in seemed incapable of tolerating honesty. I worked with people who thought they were going crazy because they had believed so many lies they didn't know what reality was. I saw people who had gotten so absorbed in other people's problems that they didn't have time to identify or solve their own. These were people who had cared so deeply and often destructively about other people that they had forgotten how to care for themselves. The codependents felt responsible for so much because the people around them felt responsible for so little that they were just taking up the slack. I saw hurting, confused people who needed comfort, understanding, and information. I saw victims of alcoholism who didn't drink but were nonetheless victimized by alcohol. I saw victims struggling desperately to gain some kind of power over their perpetrators. They learned from me, and I learned from them. Soon I began to subscribe to some new beliefs about codependency. Codependents aren't crazier or sicker than alcoholics, but they hurt as much or more. And they haven't cornered the market on agony, but they have gone through their pain without the anesthetizing effects of alcohol or other drugs, or the other high states achieved by people with compulsive disorders. And the pain that comes from loving someone who's in trouble can be profound. The chemically dependent partner, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to read without crying. The chemically dependent partner numbs the feelings, and the non-abuser is doubled over in pain, relieved only by anger and occasional fantasies. Wrote Janet from a book called Codependency, an Emerging Issue. Codependents are that way sober because they went through what they did sober. No wonder codependents are so crazy. Who wouldn't be after living with the people they lived with? It's been difficult for codependents to get that information and the practical help they need and deserve. It's tough enough to convince alcoholics or other disturbed people to seek help. It's more difficult to convince codependents, those who by comparison look but don't feel normal, that they have problems. Codependents suffered in the backdrop of the sick person. If they recovered, they did that in the background too. Until recently, many counselors like me didn't know what to do to help them. Sometimes codependents were blamed. Sometimes they were ignored. Sometimes they were expected to magically shape up. An archaic attitude that has not worked with alcoholics, and it doesn't help with codependents either. Rarely were codependents treated as individuals who needed help to get better. Rarely were they given a personalized recovery program for their problems and their pain. Yet, by its nature, alcoholism and other compulsive disorders turn everyone affected by their illness into victims. People who need help even if they're not drinking, using drugs, or gambling, overeating, or overdoing a compulsion. That's why I wrote this book. It grew out of my research, my personal and professional experiences, and my passion for the subject. It is personal and in some places prejudiced opinion. I'm not an expert, and this isn't a technical book for experts. Whether the person you've let yourself be affected by is an alcoholic, gambler, foodaholic, workaholic, sexaholic, criminal, rebellious teenager, neurotic parent, another codependent, or any combination of the above, this book is for you, the codependent. This book is not about how you can help your alcoholic or troubled person, although if you get better, his or her chance of recovery improves too. There are plenty of good books on how to help alcoholics. This book is about your most important and probably most neglected responsibility, taking care of yourself, and it's about what you can do to start feeling better. I've tried to round up some of the best, most helpful thoughts on codependency. I've included quotes from people I consider experts to demonstrate their beliefs. I've also included case histories to show how people dealt with particular problems. And although I've changed names and certain details to protect privacy, all case histories are true and not composites. I've entered endnotes to document information, to suggest additional reading, and to attribute material to appropriate sources. But much of what I've learned has been from the many people and their similar thoughts on this subject. Many ideas have been handed down and passed around, and their sources have become indistinguishable. I've tried to attribute accurately, but in this field that's not always possible. Although this is a self-help how-to book, please remember it is not a cookbook for mental health. Each person is unique. Each situation is unique. Try to tap into your own healing process. That may include seeking professional help, attending self-help groups such as Al-Anon or the Codependents, and calling unto the assistance of a power greater than yourself. A friend, Scott, who is a professional at the mental health field, told me a therapy fable. He heard it from someone who heard it from someone else, and it goes, once upon a time, a woman moved to a cave in the mountains to study with a guru. She wanted, she said, to learn everything there was to know. The guru supplied her with a stack of books and left her alone so she could study. Every morning, the guru returned to the cave to monitor the woman's progress. In his hand, he carried a heavy wooden cane. Each morning, he asked her the same question. Have you learned everything there is to know yet? Each morning, her answer was the same. No, she said, I haven't. The guru would then strike her over the head with his cane. The scenario repeated itself for months. One day, the guru entered the cave, asked the same question, heard the same answer, and raised his cane to hit her in the same way, but the woman grabbed the cane from the guru, stopping his assault in mid-air. Relieved to end the daily batterings, but fearing reprisal, the woman looked up at the guru. To her surprise, the guru smiled. "Congratulations," he said. "You have graduated. You now know everything you need to know." "How's that?" the woman asked. "You have learned that you will never learn everything there is to know," he replied, "and you have learned how to stop the pain." That's what this book is about. Stopping the pain and gaining control of your life. Many people have learned it, and you can too.